All right, let's dive into a really crucial moment in Indian history, one that really set the stage for how the British Empire would take shape. We're talking about the Charter Act of 1813. So think about this for a second. How can a single law, basically just a charter renewal, start to pull apart a massive corporate empire like the East India Company? It sounds unlikely, but that's exactly what happened. Let's find out how. Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at why this change had to happen. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the act itself. What did it actually say? After that, we'll talk about its impact, the criticisms it faced, and finally, how it really put India on the path to direct British rule. Okay, so to really get the importance of this act, you have to understand what was going on in Britain in the early 1800s. There was this perfect storm of political, economic, and even religious forces that made a big change like this pretty much unavoidable. You've got this perfect storm brewing, right? Economically, Napoleon's blockading Europe, so British merchants are desperate for new places to sell their goods. And they're all looking at India, this huge market that's totally locked up by the company's monopoly. Then politically, you have Parliament getting really antsy about this incredibly powerful, almost independent company running amok. And on top of all that, there's this growing religious movement pushing hard for Christian missionaries to be allowed into India. It's a lot of pressure from all sides. Now, what's really important to understand is that the 1813 Act didn't just come out of nowhere. It was part of a clear pattern. It really started back in 1773 with the Regulating Act. That was the British government's first real attempt to get a handle on the company. From that point on, with each charter renewal, Parliament was just tightening its grip, bit by bit, chipping away at the company's power. So with all that pressure building up, how did it actually get written into law? Let's look at these specific and honestly game-changing parts of the act itself. This was the big one, the absolute game changer. The act shattered the East India Company's complete monopoly over trade with India. I mean, this monopoly was the very foundation of its power. Now, they did get to keep their monopoly on the super profitable tea trade and all trade with China, but for everything else, the floodgates were officially open for every other British merchant. The act was this really interesting balancing act. On one hand, it extended the company's rule for another 20 years, which kind of looks like a vote of confidence, but at the same time, it massively ramped up the crown's power, making it crystal clear who was really in charge. And then, in a huge social shift, it officially gave the green light for Christian missionaries to operate in India. And then there's this. This was a landmark clause. For the very first time, the act required that 1 lakh rupees, that's 100,000, be set aside every year for education and science among Indians. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't a ton of money, but symbolically, whoa, this was a massive step. You know, this part really highlights the fundamental shift in thinking. The Act explicitly stated that the British Crown was the sovereign power over the company's territories. These lands were no longer just some corporate assets. They were now officially part of the British domain, and their laws had to be run by Parliament. Okay. So we've seen what the act said on paper. But what did all this mean for people on the ground in India? What were the real, lasting consequences? Economically, for some, ending the monopoly was, well, it was a disaster. The market was flooded with cheap, machine-made British goods, especially textiles. Traditional Indian industries just couldn't compete. This had a devastating impact on countless local artisans and craftspeople. But even with that huge economic downside, you can't deny the Act's long-term significance. It helped create a more structured government, it established the idea that the state was responsible for Indian education, and it kicked off a profound cultural shift with the missionaries. And, most importantly, it laid all the legal groundwork for the Crown to completely take over in 1858. But you know, this act was far from perfect. It certainly wasn't praised by everyone. It got a lot of criticism from all sides, both back in Britain and, of course, in India. Let's go back to that education fund. While it was historic, critics right away said, look, 100,000 rupees is a drop in the bucket for a population this huge. A lot of people saw it as just a symbolic gesture, something to make reformers in London feel good, rather than a serious attempt to transform education in India. The criticisms really centered on this core contradiction. For some people, the act didn't go nearly far enough. The company still had its administrative power and that valuable tea monopoly. But for others, the act went way too far by imposing Western values. They saw the missionary clause as a direct attack on Indian religious and social traditions. So when you weigh all the provisions, the impact, and the criticisms, what's the final verdict? What is the ultimate legacy of the Charter Act of 1813? I think the ultimate takeaway is this. The act wasn't some big revolution that ended company rule overnight. Not at all. Instead, you should see it as a critical step, a really crucial one, that weakened the company, strengthened the crown, and basically set the whole stage for that final transfer of power a few decades down the road. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. Was this act really about reform and bringing enlightenment like its supporters claimed? Or was it a much more calculated move, a blueprint for establishing total imperial control? The truth, as it usually is probably somewhere in the middle.